We just wanted to quickly jump on here and talk about something that we've been discussing amongst ourselves a lot, which is the parasitic nature of Europeans and the benefit of being in environments where you are the majority.
Right. Right. So
we have a few notes.
Right. So we have a few notes, and basically we're talking about how Yorugu, or the European, is a parasite.
Right.
And parasite just means someone who lives or leashes off of the life of others.
Exactly.
So that's the definition of parasite that we're using.
Mm-hmm.
So the first point we want to make is that white people exist within a parasitic ecology. Everything in their environment depends on the master-slave relationship.
Right.
Whereas Africans, we are mutualistic in our ecology, which means we practice ma'at imbalance.
Balance, right. Reciprocity.
Right. So when you look at the European, whether we're talking about slavery, colonialism, or capitalism today, they cannot survive without leashing off of the resources and manpower of African people. And that's important to note, because whenever we're looking at European societies, you have to understand they're coming from a background of genetic recessiveness. Whenever you have a genetically recessive group of people, they can only survive by living off of the life force of the genetically dominant.
Right. And we use the analogy a lot of mosquitoes.
Yes.
Mosquitoes need a life source to leech off of.
Yes.
If they don't have that life source, they die. They can't lay their eggs.
Right.
So, and also too, when you have a parasite on you, the parasite is getting something and the host is getting nothing.
Yes.
So we have to remember that as well when we're using this analogy. Is we consider when we say Europeans are a parasite, we're not just being funny, or we're not just being
pejorative.
We're being honest and saying that the host African people don't have, there's no benefit, none. It's not like, there's a few benefits. There's literally no benefits for being in environments where the parasite is leeching off of you, right? That the only person that benefits is the parasite.
Exactly.
And that's why they need you there, because if you leave, then they die.
Right, and the key word in my wife's description was the word environment. And that brings us to our second point about repatriation, which is that repatriation is a spiritual and biological regeneration. And we know this because in the ancient African teachings, we find that the African has always been connected with the earth. They've always had a relationship with the herbs, a relationship with the water, a relationship with the animal life. And when you enter a society like Yorugu, what you're entering is a synthetic, manufactured society.
Unnatural society.
Unnatural.
Concrete jungles.
Yes.
Synthetic water, synthetic air, synthetic food, synthetic people. All of these things are products of being in an unnatural space. And that's why being on the continent is transformative in every aspect of your life, simply because you're in your most natural space.
Yes, you're in a holistic space.
Because anybody can live anywhere, right? Like, we could travel to any part of the world in Antarctica. You could technically live, but is that where you're supposed to be? And your body is going to start adapting and changing to the environment that you decide to live in, right? And part of living in America is you, as an African person, you had to change to adapt. You had to change to adapt to the parasite. Imagine a dog changing to morph into the society of the flea. Like, it doesn't make sense, right? And it's actually impossible for it to happen. But over time, this is where we are today.
Yes. So the dog flea analogy is a very apt analogy, because it gives us a sense of the disparity in terms of the population ratios. So as African people, we're a global majority.
Yes.
Yorugus are a global minority.
In America, the black people are the minority, but
we have to expand our consciousness
globally,
to understand as a global majority, it makes no sense for that global minority to be dictating the health standards, the psychological standards, the spiritual practices, all of these things. They're designed to enforce a parasitic relationship, a master-slave relationship between Africans and Europeans. So our next point is the host is always bigger than the parasite. The parasite nourishes itself biologically by exploiting and spiritually plagiarizing the ways of the host.
Right.
So two common historical examples of this is during the slave experience, it was not uncommon for Yurugus to have their babies nursed on the breast of African women.
We've seen pictures of it.
We've seen pictures of it. This was the so-called wet nurse.
Right.
And the wet nurse is just a symbolic representation of the relationship between African peoples and Europeans throughout history. They've always understood that they need genetically,
we are dominant.
They have a necessity
Yes.
to leash off of the African.
Right.
And in outside of this biological dependency, you also see a plagiarism in terms of Europeans hijacking African spiritual systems,
Right.
hijacking our religion, hijacking our symbols, taking our unks and turning them into crosses.
Right, and we've seen this before, but we label it as cultural appropriation.
Yes.
Or we label it as, oh, y'all just don't have no culture and
Right.
you're just trying. No, they have to do this.
Yes.
This is not an option for them. This is just something they have to do.
Yes.
The mosquito has to feed off of something else,
Right.
something living, something more dominant than it to survive. You
Right.
see? So we have to get away from these labels of cultural appropriation and just being racist white people. No, we're not dealing with racist white people.
Right.
We're dealing with parasites.
Right.
And when you start labeling white people as parasites, and then you can start looking at them as a whole, which is the goal as well. Because us looking at them is just, you don't look at one mosquito as just one mosquito, right?
Right.
You look at the mosquitoes as they all trying to bite me. They,
Yes, as a member of a mosquito colony.
Right.
And that's our next point, which is once you look at white people as parasites, you stop viewing them as individuals. And so as my wife said, if you were outside and you got bit by one mosquito and you killed that mosquito, and then you looked to your left or right and you saw a mosquito colony, you saw a bucket of water and mosquitoes were just massing around that bucket of water, what sense would it make if you just walked up to that bucket and said, well, I killed the bad mosquito, and since I've killed the bad mosquito, this entire colony of mosquitoes therefore presents no threat to me.
Right.
That would be idiotic. Well, we're saying in the same way it would be idiotic to walk into a colony of mosquitoes after you've killed the so-called bad mosquito. It makes no sense for you to voluntarily live in the presence of Yurugus when historically they've demonstrated that they cannot survive without leashing and exploiting the wealth and resources and life force of African people.
Exactly, and this is why they brought us to them, right?
Yes.
This is why they came to the continent here in Africa and removed us from our natural state and brought us to where they can leech off on us endlessly. Endlessly. They never had intentions of returning Africans back to Africa. When slavery ended, they understood that this was something that they were going to continue to be able to leech off of.
Yes.
This was an investment for them.
Yes.
You understand that? So I feel like once we process the fact that you're needed, and black people, I've heard black people say this before, like white people wouldn't be able to, the economy would crash if black people left and all these things. Like that's minor. White people could not survive.
Yes.
And this is another reason why they don't advocate for you going back to Africa. They tell you to go back to Africa as an insult because they know you don't want to go back.
Yes. Because
you've been brainwashed to think that being in proximity to the mosquito is beneficial to you.
Yes.
But they understand that if all y'all went back to somewhere, it don't even have to be Africa. If you left their proximity, you would see white people leaving America.
Yes. Yes.
You understand?
Yes.
They need you. They need us to leash off on. Spiritually, culturally, physically. That's what parasites are.
Yes. So therefore, the biggest threat to Yurugu is total divestment.
Total.
And total means in all those arenas of life that my wife just mentioned: spiritual, biological. Economic, psychological. Now, and let's focus on that because that brings us to our next point, which is the psychological parasitism that Yurugu imposes on Africans.
Yes.
So the reason black people are unaware of the presence of white diseases of the mind, because like parasitic mosquitoes, they suck our life in a stealthy, sneaky way. and we don't notice it until it's too late. Therefore, we must act preemptively. So what is the psychological parasitism that Urugu imposes on Africans? So there's a mental illness, and this is a mental illness I advise listeners to look up. It is featured in a documentary by the name of Swedish Twins, Super Soldier. So go to any streaming video site and type in Swedish Twins YouTube, Super Soldier, and you'll get a description of this psychological illness, which is called shared psychotic disorder. And in this story, they tell of the story of two twins, identical twins, one who's psychotic and the other who isn't. But over time, because of the proximity of the twins, the one who isn't psychotic becomes psychotic. And this is the
just
perfect,
from being in their environment.
just for being in the same environment and being in close proximity to one another. And our argument is African people in America, African people in captivity, because we're in close proximity with our enemies, we've therefore adopted the psychotic behavior of our enemies. And
of a parasite.
And this infiltration of our minds has happened unbeknownst to us, because like the mosquito who sucks the blood from its host without the host knowing, the Urugu has sucked the life force from the African without the African knowing.
Drained it dry.
So now we are infected with the psychotic illnesses of Urugu, the psychotic illnesses of greed, the psychotic illnesses of individuality, the psychotic illnesses of homosexuality, and all these illnesses that do destruction to African people.
And what are some of these diseases that we're talking about? He just named some of them, but also anxiety, depression, ADHD,
suicide,
insomnia. All of these things are unnatural things for African people. Urugu, white people, it makes sense why they would have insomnia in the caves, because they had to look over their backs all the time. They couldn't sleep peacefully.
There wasn't a flowing of melatonin.
No, they didn't have that. They didn't have a balance between sunlight and darkness. They had majority darkness. So it makes sense why these behaviors and why they have that anxiety, why they have a savage appetite, a deep, deranged, savage appetite, why they like stuff like BDSM. All these things, all these diseases have been now put into black people, and now you have black people engaging in these same things and thinking that anxiety is normal. Get postpartum depression. What is that? You think that was a thing when we were in our white African minds? No. White people in the caves, it made sense for them to have postpartum depression. It makes sense. It doesn't make sense for us.
Because mothering becomes a liability in an environment of scarcity.
Cancers, all these diseases are part of being in the presence of parasites. Once we wrap our minds around that, and part of the reason why we know this is because we've been here for over a year, and I don't see children with ADHD. I see 3-year-olds walking their siblings by themselves, book bags bigger than them, like adults. They can hold conversations with you without fidgeting and shaking, and like it's a completely different mind, and it's because they're not in proximity to white people.
So we, as African people, we have to begin using our brains and coming with a scientific analysis of our enemies, and a military analysis of our enemies. And that means we have to not be in proximity to them, because the closer we are in proximity to our enemies, the more we will be infected by their illnesses.
And we can't survive doing the things they do. We cannot do it. We can't. Their bodies are built different. They can chug liquor and chug beer and do those things very easily. When Africans do it, you will die. That, like, you can't do the things they do. They can do that and live for a very long time, and you try, you ain't gonna live that long. Our bodies are completely different. Everything about us is different, but especially our internal organs and stuff. So please understand, when we talk about leaving the continent, we're doing this, we're saying it so that we preserve our people. We want to preserve our people, and we see that you can't preserve something that has something leaching off it. You have to get the mosquito off. You have to remove yourself from the mosquito colony so that you don't get malaria or you don't get yellow fever.
And we have to understand that relocation out of captivity is not a preference,
It's not.
but it's a genetic priority.